Good evening, everyone. I'm Vince Stango, Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer at the National Constitution Center, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program. Just a few housekeeping things to note before we begin. Our spring-summer season of America's Town Hall is drawing to a close, and what a remarkable few months it's been. On July 10th, we will host our final program of the season, featuring scholars Erwin Chemerinsky and Frederick Lawrence and Slate's Dahlia Lithwick for a discussion on the Supreme Court's 2017-2018 term. Now, while this event is sold out, we encourage guests without tickets to watch the live stream of the event at constitutioncenter.org/live. We look forward to announcing the fall town hall program lineup next month. And to make sure you remain in the know, please sign up for our mailing list, which you can do on our website, constitutioncenter.org, or on the survey you received at registration today. Beginning this summer, members will receive pre-sale access to our upcoming town hall programs, another great reason to consider NCC membership. In addition to ticket pre-sales, members of the National Constitution Center receive free tickets to our popular daytime programs and discounted tickets to our evening and on-site continuing legal education programs. If you are interested in becoming a member, visit the membership table in the Kirby lobby for more information or to join today. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's guests. Ben Rhodes served as Deputy National Security Advisor to President Barack Obama. Prior to joining the Obama administration, he was a senior speechwriter and foreign policy advisor to the Obama campaign. He joins us today to discuss his new book, The World as It Is, a New York Times bestseller and behind-the-scenes account of some of the most consequential and controversial moments of the Obama presidency. Copies of The World as It Is are available for sale outside of the auditorium, where Mr. Rhodes will be available to sign copies after the program. And we're also pleased to welcome tonight's moderator, Mark Bowden. Mark Bowden is a best-selling author and national correspondent to The Atlantic. He is best known for writing Black Hawk Down, A Story of Modern War, which was a finalist for the National Book Award and the basis for the movie of the same name. Please join me in welcoming Ben Rhodes and Mark Bowden.
Thank you, Vince. Well, thank you. So I guess my big question is, can you get Obama to come back?
It's funny. We travel. I still travel with Obama when he goes overseas. And other countries don't understand that the term limits don't prevent you from running again. Right. So they're always like, you're going to run again in 2020, right? And I have to explain to them that that's not actually in the Constitution.
Sadly. So I always ask myself this question when I write a book, and that is, what were you trying to accomplish with this book? And if you could think for a minute about whether there were any other books like it, memoirs that you liked and that inspired you.
That's a great question. So when I sat down to do this, and I was a little discombobulated coming out of 8 years in the White House and with our successor, I realized that I didn't really like the genre of political memoirs that much. I had been, I'd seen some of them come out when I was still in government, and they usually, are kind of a list of meetings that I was in, and here's why I was right in every one of those meetings, and here's some people that I need to settle some scores with, But what I realized that I had that was different, and that could be the entry point for the book, is that when I went to work for Barack Obama in 2007 on his campaign, I was 29 years old and basically an anonymous, normal person. I wasn't Hillary Clinton or Leon Panetta or Bob Gates, and that could allow me to tell a story about what it's like to go from being nobody, to suddenly being in these rooms. And it's kind of a coming of age story. And I tried to weight the book towards having much more personal detail. So not just a situation room, but what kind of impact does that have on your life, and how do you change? And also I realized I had this great opportunity, number one, from having been there the first day, and then the last day of the administration, literally flying out with the Obamas to California for their vacation. But also to let Barack Obama speak, not at the head of the Situation Room table, but in between meetings and car rides, and just to try to let him emerge as a real three-dimensional person.
Right.
So that was the goal, is to say, how do I make this a more accessible, the reader could kind of enter those rooms through me as somebody who is more recognizable to them than someone who's a long-established public figure. The models, there weren't that many. A couple that came to mind, like John Dean's first memoir was actually quite good, Blind Faith, because he did that too. He described basically how, I didn't work for a guy who got impeached, obviously, but he described kind of like the personal aspect of being in that situation. And George Stephanopoulos did the same with his memoir. So those were a couple of good ones.
Right. Unprecedented access for a writer. And you had started out wanting to be a writer, and I know that you worked for the 9/11 Commission, you worked for Congressman Hamilton, I guess, for a while. Did you start out with Obama writing for him, or were you there for other reasons?
Yeah, I started out writing for him. I describe in the book the first time I met him, where I was so nervous that I couldn't formulate a full paragraph, and therefore I had to just ask him questions as a way of giving him advice. Right. But I was hired as a speechwriter, but also the lead foreign policy advisor for him in the Senate was a guy named Mark Lippert, who got called up to serve in Iraq because he was in the reserves. So they needed somebody who could write speeches and somebody who knew something about foreign policy to move out to Chicago, basically at a moment's notice. My wife, who's here tonight, wasn't crazy when I came home and I said, guess what? I got a job. And guess what? I'm moving to Chicago next week, So I was hired to write for this man who, so much of what people admire about him is his speaking, including obviously the speech he gave here.
And the books that he had written as
and
well.
the books that he'd written. So it was kind of a daunting, it was exciting, but at the same time, a bit of a daunting thing. It's like being hired as a songwriter for Mick Jagger or something. You better get it right.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that, we were talking earlier before we came out about that great speech that Obama gave here at the Constitution Center about race when he was running for office. Talk a little bit about how that speech came together and what was unique about it.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is that the best thing you can hope for as a speechwriter for someone like Obama, who's a great writer, is that he rewrites the speech, because it's going to be much, much better. Because ultimately, the best thing you can do as a speechwriter, it's not the quality of what you write, it's whether what you write reflects the authentic voice of the person delivering the speech. Right. And so the challenge is, you could write the greatest, 8-page speech about a topic, but if it's not true to the person delivering it, it's not going to be as good. And so you would want him to edit your speech very heavily. In that case, this decision was made on the campaign. There's this huge uproar over Jeremiah Wright, his pastor, and remarks he'd made. And he'd kind of avoided talking about race and on the campaign. And the decision was made, let's just take this head on and give a speech about it. And I remember there was a draft produced out of the speechwriting team for him, and he kind of didn't get back to us. And then suddenly he emerges, and he had not just edited, he'd just written a different speech himself, which only happened kind of 3 or 4 times in the whole 10 years I worked for him, where he completely wrote the speech by himself. And I'll never forget sitting there, I was with John Favreau, who was the lead speechwriter on the campaign, and reading this speech he'd written. And it was so personal and so direct. And the thing I remember being struck by is he has so much respect for the people he's delivering the speech to, because it's complicated, it's personal, it assumes kind of a good faith in the listener, and that encapsulated what was different about Barack Obama as a politician, as much as anything else that any other speech he gave in the time I worked for him.
And generally, would you sit with him and discuss kind of what his concept was for a speech, or would he, leave you with sort of, this is what I want in it? Or sometimes did you just have to do it yourself and show it to him? How did that process work?
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, for a president, there's speeches he give kind of on a routine basis that he might only read once or twice and make some small edits to. But if it was a big speech, and I in the book, I take people into some of the speeches I did for him. So for instance, the speech he gave in Cairo to the Muslim world. For a speech like that, he would call me up to the Oval Office at the beginning of the process, like before I had written anything. And he would basically narrate an outline. And he would usually have kind of marked up an outline on a notepad. And I remember, he would pace slowly around the Oval Office and kind of narrate what he wanted to say, point by point. Sometimes he'd stop and kind of say a line that he would want in there. And I'd furiously write this down because it's gold for a speechwriter. I don't think that's happening today in the White House. I'm just going to go out on a limb and say I don't think Stephen Miller is going in there and getting all this kind of academic history of the Muslim world from President Trump. But then what was always strange experiences, I'd do a draft and then I'd send, you'd have to circulate it to kind of the political and policy advisors, and they would then edit it. And it was a bit like having a carcass with a bunch of birds who were pulling it apart, because the political advisors don't want to say anything that could be misconstrued or is too edgy. The policy advisors, want to say things as if it's like a white paper for a think tank. And so it was always, you turn into an editor and you're kind of a goalie and you're trying to kind of keep the message that President Obama wants to give from being too watered down. But you have to be mindful that, yes, we don't want to start a war in this speech, so if I have to change this line, I'll do that. And then, after you go through that process, it would go back to President Obama, and then he would edit it. And for something like that speech in Cairo, like he would go through 15 drafts. I mean, he described the process, you might appreciate this as a writer, Mark, as a sculptor chipping away at a block, until you get the image that you want. And so that's what he would do. And I found myself in the strange position a lot of times of having to tell people much more senior than me, well, no, he wants to say it this way. And they never blame the boss for that, so they would always blame me. There's Rhodes. He's
but an unwritten part of the job.
Yeah,
right?
But it was it's because he had a very strong view about what he wanted to say and how he wanted to say it.
Right. One of the lines that struck me early in your book was you were watching Obama give a speech, and he wrote, "I realized that the words he spoke would not be as powerful as the image of him, an African American standing on these stages. This was the gift and the struggle of working for Obama." Could you explain what you meant by that?
Yeah, so this was, I was referring to the speech he gave in Berlin to 250,000 Germans. And, if you're a speechwriter, you obviously think that this text is the most important thing in the world. This draft that you've been living with for 2 or 3 weeks, every word matters, and what line are people going to digest. But at the end of the day, I realized that, yes, a lot of those 250,000 people were there because they wanted to hear the speech. But more so, he represented something about what people here and in other countries wanted to believe about America. That America could change, that America could be represented by somebody like this. Yes, somebody who's a minority, an African American, but also somebody who is from an economically disadvantaged background and somebody who carries himself with a certain kind of dignity. And so...
And has an international background.
And has an international, which overseas was really important in a way that Americans, I think, didn't fully appreciate. Just a side note, like one of the strangest things about working for Barack Obama is every country that we went to, it was like, if you all remember the 2008, Grant Park, the night he was elected, it was like that till the very end of the presidency everywhere we went. Like he maintained that sense of meaning to people in other countries. And he would give speeches in other countries that wouldn't even register here. But I could go back to that country several years later and meet people who are like quoting me lines from that speech, you know? And a big part of that was what he represented, which is to billions of people around the world, he represented the fact that you could go from nothing or from being a minority to being the most powerful man in the world. And so the speeches, yes, were important, but more important was who he was and what he represented to people. And that was a huge opportunity, but it was a bit of a burden in that, you know, it was hard to fully capture that for an audience, because, you know, he's the president of the United States. Ultimately, he has to talk about our interests, our foreign policies. He's got to speak above all to an audience back home. You know, he can't just be the icon, Barack Obama. He had to be the president of the United States, Barack Obama. And in a way, you know, that means he's going to let people down a little bit, you know.
Right. Yeah. You entitled your book "The World as It Is," and it tells the story, your story, of kind of disillusionment to an extent. I mean, the belief that you had going in of how much the Obama administration might change the world, and the difficulties encountered along the way, I think kind of, if I read correctly, sort of beat some of that enthusiasm out of you. You mentioned it, that the expression for the first time when you're writing about Obama about to give his speech in Oslo. And
yep.
Samantha Power had been trying to sort of beef up the remarks to essentially announce a new American policy. Yeah. And you wrote that John Favreau and I made the final edits, language that spoke of the tension between the world as it is and our effort to strive for the world that ought to be. So talk a little bit about that. And also I'm curious to know, I mean, I know in reading the book, because you're writing about your own experience, the change that you went through, do you think that President Obama went through a similar kind of experience?
So first of all, you know, what that comes from is a Nobel Peace Prize address that he had to give. And it was interesting. He gets this award, and we wrote a first draft of that speech. That the central tension that we were trying to address is him getting the award so early in his presidency. And he was going to be awarded this Nobel Peace Prize shortly after he announced the surge of troops in Afghanistan. And exactly, right? You all understood this much better than I did, apparently, because what happened was we gave him this draft, and he didn't get back to us for days. And the morning that we were going to leave for Oslo, he called us in, and he gave me a totally rewritten speech, like the race speech is one of those 4 speeches. And what he had made it is a speech about the tension of not getting it early in his presidency, but of getting a peace prize when he's a commander-in-chief for the U.S. military and just had sent more troops into a war where they were going to kill people and they were going to be killed. And he describes the whole speech as wrestling with the fact that war is sometimes necessary, even though war is basically a failure of human beings. And he describes what I was talking about, this tension between who he was as kind of an icon versus who he was as an office holder, that his heroes were Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela. And he focused on Gandhi and King, and he said, you know, I cannot practice their ideology of nonviolence while executing the office of being American president. You know? And I know that every time I take a drone strike or if I surge troops in Afghanistan, I'm not living up to what their vision is, but I also believe that sometimes that's necessary. But then what he said is that that's not a reason to not aspire to the vision of the world articulated by those people, that you have to see the world as it is while at the same time pursuing the world as it ought to be, which is their vision. And it's a really kind of complicated wrestling with how do you act in a world that is imperfect. So that's where the title came from, and it ended up being a good summation of our whole presidency, which is we were surrounded by a lot of factors that were conspiring to resist the world that we would want, and we had to recognize them while still pursuing it. In terms of transformation, I think I went through that transformation. I do not think that he did. I think that people kind of failed to understand the extent to which he always had a kind of basic sense of realism. And I attribute that to two things. One, he's an African American, and as an African American, he never bought into the notion that his election was going to change, for instance, how racism was dealt with in America. Mm-hmm. You know, the person who was least surprised about the extent of racism that confronted him as president was Barack Obama. You know, in a way that I, as a white American who thought the 2008 election was transformative, probably, you know, underestimated those forces. And the second thing is that he is that international experience you spoke of. You know, he lived in Indonesia as a child at a time when there had recently been a coup that led to hundreds of thousands of people being killed in violence. And his father was from Kenya and had gone back there with his degrees from Harvard and had been met with tribalism and corruption that ultimately led him, you know, frankly, to his death. And so Obama always understood that the world is a tough place in a way that probably I didn't fully appreciate. And I think I also probably was overly influenced by how well the 2008 election went. You know, like everything seemed like it was doable. You know, like we caught lightning in a bottle and everything went right, you know, and we beat everybody. You know, we won this protracted primary, we won this overwhelming victory. There's this kind of almost cathartic moment in American history. And it just felt like that was going to be a wave that we could ride. And instead, we immediately start to butt up against some deeply entrenched forces that were there the whole 8 years.
Right. The book has been warmly received many, many places, but Marty Parrots wrote a review.
It was not warmly received by Marty Parrots.
Right, not so much in the Wall Street Journal. And I wanted to ask you about it just because it raised a question about you and about Obama that I'm sure you've heard many times before, and that is that the Obama administration was so confident of its own perspective on the world and its own agenda that those who disagreed with it were somehow fundamentally flawed, you know, morally or intellectually. And he criticized you in this book because he felt that it reflected. So I want to give you a chance to talk about that. And I think if you're like me and you get a review that criticizes you, you spend a lot of time thinking about it.
Well, I didn't think that much about it because I've been hearing that from him and kind of some people in his orbit for years. And I think my answer is it's such a profound misread of us and of the book, because the book is all about us trying to make what we believe the right choices were, but not knowing if they were the right choices. You know, we didn't. What's so interesting about that line of criticism is that, unlike, I would argue, Marty Parrots or kind of a neoconservative element in our foreign policy, what Barack Obama was seeking to acknowledge throughout his presidency were the limits of what America could achieve, and that we don't have all the answers, and that we don't have a kind of dogmatic certainty about everything that we were doing. And in a weird way, that's what infuriated some people, you know, because we had this debate about American exceptionalism for 8 years, basically, with people like this. And their view of American exceptionalism seemed to be that whatever we do is right because we're America. And Obama's view of American exceptionalism is we are exceptional because of our ability to improve, our ability to recognize where we got it wrong in the past and to try to do better in the future. And that acknowledgement of past mistakes, like the Iraq War, for instance, drove people like this literally to distraction, right? So it's one of these criticisms that is actually kind of projection, in my view, which is they're still so certain that it was right to go to war in Iraq, or it was right to do this. We're acknowledging fallibility, and that seems to drive some people crazy.
Right. And that came up during what came to be known as the apology tour.
The apology
you write
tour,
about this in your book. Can you talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, well, it was a fascinating thing because I described like the first foreign trip that Obama took as president. And keep in mind that when we came into office, you'd had two really catastrophic events that had taken place, the Iraq War and the financial crisis. And both of them were acts by the United States, that had had huge consequences on other countries. And I described we went to London first for the G20, where we basically had to go around to the leading economies in the world and try to get them to kind of match our stimulus to essentially bail out the global economy. And then we go to NATO summit in France and Germany, where we essentially had to pass around the hat for troops for Afghanistan, a war that had gone badly wrong because we had diverted into Iraq. Meanwhile, we're asking all these countries to take 1, 2, or 3 Gitmo detainees to try to close Guantanamo. In other words, and Obama said this to me, I'm spending all this political capital he had as being this newly elected popular president around the world. I'm spending all this political capital just to try to climb out of this hole, And so over the course of that trip, in a series of speeches, he worked in some language to try to acknowledge, our responsibility for the financial crisis, or how we got it wrong on torture. But he always would frame it as what makes America great is our ability to recognize in our democracy that this was wrong and to fix it and to improve ourselves. And then we went to Turkey and to try to address Turkish human rights violations. He talked about the fact that, in our country, and we were talking about minority rights there, Kurdish rights. In our country, he couldn't even have voted in parts of the country when he was born, and his parents could not. It would have been illegal for his parents to get married. But what makes America great is our ability through the civil rights movement to promote change. He was actually telling a story about American patriotism. That what makes us exceptional and different is our democracy allows citizens to stand up to the civil rights movement and make this a better country, or stand up in an election and say that we don't believe torture is right. And when we got home, that had become the apology tour. And what was, it was easy to be, annoyed by it, but it was actually a more interesting debate than that, because it was about, again, like what is, and it's really relevant to the moment we're in right now with Donald Trump. Like, what makes America exceptional? Is it our ability to make progress? Is it our ability to improve ourselves, to have a more perfect union, as the Constitution says, and the title of that speech he gave here? Or is it just because whatever we do is great because we're America? Ripping children away from their parents is not great. It's horrible. And that, what makes America great is the fact that so many Americans expressed their horror to that even the Trump administration had to back off that policy. Right. And so that's the fundamental tension that emerged in this apology tour issue.
I mean, you evolved in the years of the administration to someone who wasn't just writing speeches, but was helping to make foreign policy, national security policy. The successful killing of Osama bin Laden was, for you, as you write it, a particularly meaningful event because you had been in New York for 9/11. Maybe I should let you tell that story.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, my life basically took a massive detour on 9/11 because I was working in New York. I was getting this master's in fiction writing, which the Republican Party has made a lot of hay out of over the years. Trust me, if they only knew how much use that master's in fiction writing was to me, they
might
not. I
want to interrupt to say that I love the New York Times reviewer who said that the book was well written, even though you have
which was a very fair point.
Degree.
Very fair point. But I was working other jobs. I was working a campaign, and that was election day, and I had kind of an unobstructed view of the Twin Towers from the polling site, and I saw the second plane hit the World Trade Center and saw the first tower collapse, and I just knew then that my whole life was going to change. That whatever I did from that moment on had to be involved with a response to that. Interestingly, actually, I went to an Army recruiter thinking I was going to sign up for the military, except the guy had no idea what to make of me. He's like, really, you're a creative writing student at NYU? Like, they weren't that interested in taking me, you know? So I didn't join the Army. But anyway, so 9/11 propelled me into foreign policy. I worked on the 9/11 Commission, and then I get this call from John Brennan, who is the counterterrorism advisor, to say that they had this lead on Osama bin Laden. And for a couple of weeks, I was in these incredibly intense meetings with President Obama as he wrestled with this question of whether to authorize a raid, even though we didn't know for sure that bin Laden was at this compound. And, you know, I remember watching him, and, you know, people are debating, and it's a split room, split advice, and you could feel the weight of the decision that a president has to make. Because I remember Bob Gates, he was against the raid, and he cited Desert One, you know, something you've written about, Mark. You know, when Jimmy Carter tried to rescue the hostages and the helicopters crashed, and I'm sitting thinking, like, don't say that out loud, you know, but that could have happened. You know, it could have been a horrific event that could have basically potentially ended his presidency. But he had to make this gut decision. And I knew he was going to go for it. I could just read it on him. And so he made the decision to do it. The whole thing was surreal, and I try to describe in the book. You know this. It's the only thing you're thinking about, but you can't tell anybody. It's a very surreal experience to know that there's like 15 to 20 people who know this thing, and you can't talk to anybody else about it. That weekend, the raid was on a Sunday. The Saturday night was something called the White House Correspondents' Dinner, which is just an awful exercise. And usually it becomes only notable because the comedian who speaks hurts some people's feelings, and Washington debates whether the comedian should have hurt people's feelings for a few days. But we all had to go because we were all invited, and if suddenly none of the national security people went to an event where all of Washington's leading journalists were, it would be kind of a tell that something is up. Yeah. And so we had to go through this whole night, and I described, like, I'd see somebody across the room who knew, and I'd kind of make eye contact, and it was like, yep, you know, all these other people have no idea what's coming tomorrow, you know. Obama has to get up, and he gave this speech where he tore apart Donald Trump, which seemed like a very trivial thing at the time, but then the next day it happens and everything goes right. And it's very rare in government where everything goes right. You know, they go in, bin Laden's there, they kill bin Laden, they pull him out. And I described this feeling in the book of, I walked outside to be by myself for a few minutes because I just wanted to occupy that. I didn't want the moment to ever end. You know, it was like, nothing is ever going to be this right. And I knew something that the rest of the world was going to learn about in a few hours. Mm-hmm. And I remember just thinking, like, this is going to make people here in the United States feel so good for once. You know, we've had so little to feel good about after 9/11. And then, of course, at the end of the night, I walked home, and I go in the door, and I see my wife, and she's like, "Do you think you told Michelle?" And I was like, "I don't know. That's above my pay grade." Yeah.
Now, I remember Michael Morrell, who then was, I guess, the acting director of the CIA, or was assistant director, was walking back from the White House, and he heard the crowds were chanting CIA. CIA. He said, this is the most disparaged agency in all of American life. And he said, I knew I'd never hear that again.
It'll never get better than that for the CIA.
Now, you know, that was your perfect moment, but you went on to, and these are painful passages to read, actually, in your book, where you became the object of conspiracy theories. Emails that you wrote were falsified and publicized. And you wrote a passage which I think rings true to all of us who've lived through the last 18 months. I felt I was living in an alternate reality that was in some ways insane, unable to recognize hypocrisy or to separate facts from politics. The world around me seemed to have come unmoored. The truth had become irrelevant. Do you think that's true in a larger sense?
Yes. And one of the most interesting things about writing the book is I found connections between things that you can only find if you write a book. And there are two things I'd say there. One is I saw that, so on the 2008 campaign, there was this problem we had where there was a preponderance of people forwarding emails about how Obama was from Kenya, or Obama was a secret Muslim, or he was a Palestinian terrorist. And they'd be so widely forwarded. It was like basically like somebody's crazy racist uncle wrote this email. But they were getting so widely forwarded that we had a whole team devoted to debunking these emails, right? I'm going to skip ahead to the end of the story to say that that forwarded email is now the President of the United States. But because what I see, the thread I saw was that that became Sarah Palin. And so when Sarah Palin got named vice president, it kind of mainstreamed this darkness in American politics. And that became the Tea Party. And then that became the birther movement. And then that became the whole Benghazi enterprise. And you could see Trump did not, as I was writing the book, I saw the extent to which Trump did not just kind of emerge out of thin air on a debate stage in 2015. In fact, by the time Trump emerged on the debate stage in 2015, he was the most logical candidate for the Republican nomination, because this had been building the entire time we were there. Personally, I walked through the weird experience, a kind of distorting, surreal experience of becoming like a player in the conspiracy theory, which for me was on Benghazi. And I describe basically like the most mundane aspect of my job was occasionally I had to compile essentially the different questions and answers and talking points in the government and give them to somebody who's going to go speak publicly. And so I did this for Susan Rice as she was going on the Sunday talk shows after the Benghazi attacks. I must have spent 5 minutes on this. It was a horrible week. This was not my priority. And that 5 minutes became this kind of key node in this conspiracy theory that we had invented a story about a video, when in fact actually that video had caused mass protests and violence across the Muslim world that week. And that I was basically this diabolical liar, spinning conspiracy out of the White House. But what was so interesting to trace the book is that I remembered there was this kind of interesting experience where every now and then Benghazi would flare up in the news, and it would be this big, spectacle. But then when it would go underground, it would grow. The conspiracy theory would build, almost like some organism deep in the ocean, getting bigger. And I would know this because of social media, because I had a Twitter account. And every now and then I would check it. You could see who's saying what to you. And every now and then, like 1,000 people would suddenly be just apoplectic and calling me names, and they'd, I'm a Muslim Brotherhood operative, or I'm a Jewish world conspiracy guy, or what, and what
or
you could,
both.
Or both, yeah. And it didn't make any sense. But what you could tell is that somewhere in America, a talk radio segment had just aired, or a Breitbart story had posted, and I could see that there was like a building ecosystem of tens of millions of Americans consuming just hatred and conspiracy theory that could take something like Benghazi, that by the end of that 4-year investigation, nobody even knew what it was about anymore. But people were convinced that something horrific had happened. And that, to me, explains Trump. That he tapped into a vein that was already wide open in American politics and media, where there was a huge segment of the population that had been fed this steady diet of anger and grievance and conspiracy theory. And both Trump and Russia, that's where they focused their effort in that election, and they rode it all the way into the White House.
Mm. Well, now, ugliness has always been a part of politics in America. Do you think it's worse today than it's been in the past? I
think it's worse because of the media, because of social media, which kind of rewards ugliness. The stuff that gets attention is negativity. And the kind of decline of traditional media. The local paper or the network news at least had a standard of fact-based reporting that, if you turn on cable television, if you turn on Fox News, it's just pure opinion. And so most Americans who might, 20 or 30 years ago have consumed the news on the network television or in their local paper, they're now consuming a website of their choice or Fox News, or they're getting stuff in their Facebook feed that is selected to validate their tribe. And I think that makes it far worse because there's not any filter anymore. It's just the pure expression of tribalism. And if one tribe goes off the rails, as I believe, frankly, the Republican Party largely has, then there's no guardrails.
Mm-hmm. So it must be painful to watch over the past 18 months the achievements of 2 terms being enthusiastically attacked and overturned and dismantled. Can you talk about that? And have you talked to President Obama about that?
Yeah, it's not that fun. It's hard. I'd be lying if I said it isn't painful. President Obama has a serenity. I think for a variety of reasons, he has a worldview that is very much about I can control what I can control, and history is a long game, and I believe that ultimately things are going to move in the direction that I was going in, not Trump. He gets a little less knocked off course than I do. It's just part of who he is. I think what I do grab onto is, and this is where I end the book, is that everybody focuses on the scorecard today of the Iran deal or the Paris Climate Agreement or what have you. But when I think about what I admire about presidents past, my hero was John F. Kennedy. I couldn't name you that many legislative achievements of John F. Kennedy. It's the feeling that he gave people and the inspiration that he provided and the words that he spoke that still resonate and are still making an impact in the world today. And there's something intangible about a president. And so, with Barack Obama, I think about, yes, there are all those achievements or legacy items, but the bigger item is what is the impact that he had on billions of people around the world and in this country? How did they change their own self-conception because of his presidency? And what are they going to do? What changes are they going to make? And when already there are more people running for office and there are more people getting engaged. And I truly believe 10, 20 years from now, when this is all sorted out, that's ultimately the legacy, is what did he do to motivate people and what are they going to do to change things?
Right, what long-term impact it has. So we have some questions from the audience. Do you see the limits of Obama's foreign policy being the result of a trend towards multipolarity in the international system? Would the United States have been able to achieve more were it still in its unipolar moment?
Yes, that's a really good question. The answer is yes. I think that a lot of the foreign policy mindset that kind of has governed in Washington for 20 years was somewhat shaped by the fact that right after the Cold War, we really could do just about anything. China had not really emerged. Russia was totally on its back foot. We could really shape events anywhere. And that was always going to be a transitory moment. And before we took office, in part because of the Iraq War and the financial crisis, but China was already emerging. Russia was already pushing back. There was already kind of more of a distribution of power in the world. And so we didn't have the freedom of action that the United States might have had in 1995. And I think Americans have to understand the difference between dominance and leadership. We are the most influential country in the world, but we're not able to dominate the world, particularly when it comes to shaping the events inside another country, whether it's Afghanistan or Iraq or Libya or Syria. And the other point is that after 15 years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then somewhat in Libya, the ability to keep taking on those types of projects, particularly when we're seeing them not work out, that's what really weighed on Obama's decision making. And I think he was trying to sustain U.S. leadership by limiting our military engagements. I think his view was we could put ourselves out of business as the world leader if all we're doing is constantly fighting wars in the Middle East. We need to pull back a little bit and do other things. We need to engage in Asia. We need to lead on climate change. We need to pursue diplomacy to stop a country like Iran from getting a nuclear weapon instead of a war. We need to settle old accounts like Cuba. And that was all about positioning America to lead in a world that is multipolar.
Ben, if you were a foreign policy advisor for 45, which I'm sure would never happen, how would you have handled the North Korea summit differently?
So, if I may just take a point to complain, I try not to focus on hypocrisy, but the image of him tearing up the Iran deal, which has this kind of incredibly intrusive inspections regime and ships 98% of their nuclear material out of the country, and he's calling it a catastrophe, and he's bucking the rest of the world to pull out, and then going to a country that has consistently broken its promises, getting nothing other than a reaffirmation of the same broken promise that they've made to every US president for the last 20 years, which is that someday they might give up their nuclear weapons, and then giving a bunch of concessions in return. That grated on me a little bit. What I would have done differently is, look, I described, to take the two examples of things I worked on Cuba, I was a negotiator, and Alejandro Castro was Raul's son. I met with him 20 times, probably for 8 hours at least each meeting, before we put President Obama in the room with Raul Castro. They did not prepare for this summit. They did not take the time. They rushed it because Trump wanted the spectacle. There's no reason that they had to have that summit when they had it. I was glad they pursued diplomacy, but they should have spent like a year figuring out what the agenda is, what we're trying to achieve, who are these people, what do we know about them, what are they willing to give. They didn't do that. That's a Cuba experience. And the second was the Iran experience. We had Ernie Moniz, who won a Nobel Prize in nuclear physics, on the negotiating team so that he could say what passes muster for an inspections regime and how do we actually dismantle this nuclear program. And I saw none of that expertise in the room with Trump, and so I think they didn't prepare, they didn't know what they wanted to get out of it. All they wanted was the ability for Trump to say he should get the Nobel Peace Prize, and he got played by Kim Jong-un. And the rest of the world, by the way, saw that. Here we all look at the reality show and you turn on TV and it's like the Republican pundit says that Trump is a hero and the Democratic pundit says, well, maybe he's not a hero. The rest of the world is looking at this and being like, these guys are amateurs.
Yeah.
They just got, the biggest one pulled over on them ever by the North Korean dictator.
Yeah. Actually, there was rare unanimity on the editorial page of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal condemning that fiasco in Singapore. This is a three-part question, but we probably won't get to all three parts. But the first one is, what is your view on the military taking the lead in foreign policy?
I think it's a bad idea, and frankly, the military would tell you it's a bad idea. I mean, the military knows how to do the things that the military is supposed to do very well. They can blow things up. I mean, you've spent more time studying the military than most people. They can conduct any mission. They can take out a terrorist. They can conduct a special operation. They can take out an air defense system. But they don't conduct foreign policy. That's not what they do. And if we take the diplomats off the field, it's more likely that the military is going to have to do those things because nobody's there to try to prevent wars or try to resolve problems before they emerge. And I think that the other problem with it, where I'll be a little critical of the military, is the military always wants more resources for what the military is doing. So in Afghanistan, they would be there forever. If we could just keep giving them more troops, give us a few more years and a few more troops, and we can get this done. Because that's their mindset. That's what they're supposed to do.
That's what they're good at.
And it takes civilians to say, you know what, we've been here for 15 years. It's not getting better. We don't need to keep doing this. And I've seen Trump remove any of those discussions. From the national security debate, and I worry about this kind of creeping escalation of conflict, where we could find ourselves back in a major way in these places. Yeah,
we've found ourselves actually in the curious position of having a retired Marine general who we're all looking to
be the biggest,
to restrain the militaristic impulses of the
and he was
president.
The biggest hawk in our administration, and now he's like the brake on the most aggressive impulses.
Yeah. Here's a speech question. How do Obama and Trump differ in how they vary and ad lib from the written text?
Where to begin?
You don't have to be nice.
Yeah, no, well, number one, Obama cared about the written text. When Trump is reading a text that's prepared for him, he almost aggressively seems to appear to be reading it for the first time and to not care what it says. You can kind of tell, like, he doesn't want to be on the text and hasn't put thought into it. Which, by the way, is, to make a serious point, I mean, one of the things that I remember being struck by when you start to write a speech for the President of the United States for the first time is how many audiences there are. There's the American people, there's the foreign audience, their allies, their adversaries. Everybody's dissecting these words. They're very important words, and Trump and his team, frankly, don't seem to care about that. I'll give you a quick example of that. All this stuff he said about North Korea, Kim Jong-un is beloved by his people, he's a strong leader. All that is going to play on an endless loop on North Korean state television. I would have been very much, like, even when we went to Cuba, and I got along well with the Cubans, we never say something that they can just take out and run on their propaganda network. It just never occurred to him that the people in the Gulag right now in North Korea, the 200,000 people who are living in concentration camps, are probably watching video of Donald Trump saying that Kim Jong-un is beloved by his people and he's a very strong leader. And I wish that my people respected me the way they respect him. That may seem like a throwaway line to him. It's not to that person who's sitting in a gulag who used to look to the American president to say things that they could look up to. And so with Trump, like, the difference is he seems to have no sense of the consequence of words and the consequence of what an American president represents to people around the world and how what they communicate is important. And the more he goes off script, the more crazy it is what he says. And here, again, it's like the expectations have lowered so much that we seem to accept that this is just theater, something for people to argue about on television. It's really, the stakes are really high. And Obama had an antenna for that, and Trump has no antenna for that.
Mm-hmm. Why did the Obama administration not do more to promote a free press and media in Arab nationalist Egypt, in Arab nations and Egypt?
We should have. I think that we fell short here. One of the mistakes I think we made was, I described the quite dramatic decision Obama took at the height of the protests in Egypt to break from President Mubarak. And I remember being in the room with him, and they had this fascinating conversation where Obama said, I think it's time for you to step down, and Mubarak was shouting at him about, you don't understand anything about this place, and Obama said to him, like, just because things have always been one way doesn't mean that they will be that way in the future. And it was a really consequential moment. What happened is, nobody in our government agreed with that position. Not the State Department, not the Defense Department, not the CIA. So after the drama of that took place, the government kind of reverted back to a policy of deferring to the Egyptian military. And then the Saudis and the Emiratis, our partners, started pouring money into Egypt to try to essentially disrupt their politics and put the military back in power. And we did not do enough to empower and support democratic forces and to stand up to the military. I think that was a mistake, because I think there was a window that opened, and look, it might have had the story might have ended the same way. But there was a window that opened in the first half of 2011 in Egypt, a country where, unlike Syria, we actually had some leverage, and I think we could have done more with it. I agree with the premise of the question.
Okay. Could Obama's roasting of Trump at the White House Correspondents' Dinner been the true catalyst for Trump's decision to seek the presidency?
So I've never believed that theory for one simple reason, which is that Trump didn't run for president against Obama, right? I mean, so if this was such a huge seismic moment, he could have run that. It was the June of 2011. I think Trump hates Obama for a lot of reasons, including his race. One of the interesting things about Obama that I describe in the book and with race is what I saw is the better he did, the more angry it made people because of race. In other words, all the way back to the foreign trip that he did in the campaign, when he nailed that trip and everything went so right, and he looked like a president of the United States overseas, that was the first time I really felt this racist kind of outcry in our politics. You might remember the angry crowds who started to show up in McCain's rallies. They were angry because Obama was succeeding. Not just because he was black, but because he was black and he was succeeding. And I think that that's what drove Trump crazy, that he, not just that he was black, but that he was successful. And that challenged a whole worldview. If Obama had been a complete disaster, I don't think they would have hated him as much.
Right. I think, one of the painful things for many of us has been, the great hopes engendered by the election of an African-American president, and then seeing this ugly backlash with its racist roots that had such resonance in the American people, albeit Trump didn't win the numbers, won in the Electoral College, but that's how you win in America.
Yeah, but it's always been a contested country. I mean, all the way back to the Constitution. And the fact of the matter is, politics, and I hope the book conveys the extent to which it's a human endeavor. The government can seem like a distant enterprise to people, but it's made up of human beings, and the people who get to work in those jobs work there because human beings go to work on campaigns and human beings vote. And so, we have the ability in this country, because of this Constitution, to say that that's not who we are, and we're going to change things. And we're going to change things in the election in November, and we're going to change things in the election in 2020. And so this is not by any stretch resolved. What I wrestle with at the end of the book is that we may not have seen coming the extent of the backlash. But that's by no means the end of the story. That's what is great about this country is we have the ability to say, we're actually not like that.
Okay. One more question from the cards here. Do you justify our remaining in Afghanistan because the United States needed to protect Pakistan, and it says something about nuclear
weapons, yeah. I don't think we should be in Afghanistan anymore. I'm a real outlier on this, but it's now more than 15 years after we went into Afghanistan. If I had told you in 2002 that we would be in Afghanistan 15 years later, 7 years after we killed Osama bin Laden, with Al-Qaeda basically not really existing in that part of the world in any meaningful form, why would you think we were doing that? And all the reasons that people give to stay, well, if we leave, the Taliban will be strong, the government could collapse. All those things are happening with us there. And maybe some of those things are happening because we are there. So I wish that we had gotten completely out of Afghanistan by the end of the Obama administration. We could, to the question about Pakistani nuclear weapons or ISIS could pop up there, the military can go do a mission, a discrete mission, very well. They don't need to be there fighting every day with over 10,000 troops in order to conduct an emergency mission or an airstrike. So I kind of reject this idea that, well, we have to be there in order to do that. No, if we see an ISIS training camp in eastern Afghanistan, we can go take that out. Yeah. But that doesn't mean we need to be patrolling Afghanistan.
And to his credit, wasn't that the argument that Joe Biden was making fairly?
It was to his credit. And I describe, people forget the Afghan Review was an important event. I go through it here. And it was kind of haunting. I reread The Best and the Brightest. That's a book I read as I was working on this. And the echoes of the decision-making process. What Obama did differently than The Best and the Brightest is he said, okay, I'll give you these troops, but they're going to begin to come home in a year and a half.
Right.
And actually, I think he deserves more credit for that. Because they would have come back and said, well, if you give us 50,000 more troops, you could totally see how that could happen. Because the whole mindset of that review was, if you give us more troops and you open up the aperture, we'll get this done. And it wasn't going to happen. And Biden was the only one saying this is crazy at the time. Obama was thinking it, he just didn't say it. And we needed enough troops to preserve, I do think we needed to be there at that time. We needed enough troops at that point to kind of create some space for us to then build this platform that led to all the efforts against Al Qaeda and bin Laden. And then you could draw it down. But people underappreciate the extent to which, absent some break from a commander-in-chief, this nation can get into a Vietnam or Iraq was actually, the irony of Iraq is actually the political leadership that pushed it, but right. in a way that we don't intend to.
Right. So you've written a book. You're coming off one of the coolest jobs ever. You have earned, I think, probably PhD level experience in American government and foreign policy. What are you going to do next?
Well, I'll probably have like a midlife crisis, Mark. It's interesting. I described the last flight I was on. We flew the Obamas out to California on Air Force One. Although it wasn't called Air Force One anymore, it was called the presidential aircraft, because if the president's not on board, it's not Air Force One. So it's the first time I really realized things were different, because we got on this plane and it's not called Air Force One, even though it's the same plane. And we're flying back, and it's like, plane's usually full of people, and there are only like 10 people on board. And one of them was a military aide, the guy who used to carry around the nuclear football. And he said to me, "You're about to go through a really intense physiological experience." And I said, "Well, what do you mean? It sounds like a bad thing." And he's like, "You don't realize that your body's been running on stress and adrenaline for 8 years. And you're going to wake up tomorrow and that's going to be gone. And it's going to take you like 6 months or a year to kind of even just work through that." He's totally right. Like, I could not get out of bed for like a while because you are running on stress and adrenaline. I then channeled that into this book. So now I think going forward, I help Barack Obama out a bit. I still kind of travel with him when he goes overseas. I have an organization that I put together to try to help Democrats on national security. But like, what I really want to start doing is more writing, and to see, if I can, have a voice that is separate and distinct from politics and tell stories. I really enjoyed telling my own story. I'd like to tell some other people's stories.
Great. Well, thank you, Ben. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John.